Thank you very much. Now, our second speaker is Professor David Kirkland. 15 minutes, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. I would like to take us back to the science and discuss genotoxicity. It's been mentioned several times this morning. It is a key factor in the overall assessment of carcinogenic potential. And what I want to describe is how a weight of evidence approach should be taken in the assessment of data such as the genotoxicity data on glyphosate, because it's complicated. This was put together by a group of 5 of us. The names are on the slide there. We all work as consultants, so yes, various organizations pay us to spend our time looking at data, providing analyses and recommendations, just as you would pay an architect or an accountant to provide you with professional advice. We all have decades of experience in the industry, and therefore we have reputations to maintain, and that means that there is no point in us being or responding to the influence of one stakeholder over another, because those reputations would be destroyed. So for a complicated, can you just press page down for me? Thank you. For a complicated set of data such as we have with glyphosate, it's necessary to undertake a rigorous weight of evidence approach, and that means we need to look at the methods, the systems, and the endpoints, and give each of them a weight that is consistent with their contribution to the overall evidence. Different assay types have different weights, so those measuring apical endpoints, such as mutations and chromosomal damage, should have greater weight than data from indicator assays, for example, measuring DNA damage, which can be reversible. And this is in line with an OECD overview accompanying the recent revisions to OECD guidelines. The robustness of the protocols, the quality and reproducibility of the evidence also influence the weight. So studies conducted to good laboratory practice and according to OECD guidelines should have greater weight than studies lacking these attributes, simply because GLP studies are audited and other studies that are in the public domain are probably not audited. The number of pieces of evidence within a category also influences the weight. So one or a few divergent responses within a majority of studies with concordant findings should not alter the direction or strength of the weight of evidence. And tests with a greater ability to extrapolate results to humans should carry greater weight. So data from animal in vivo tests should carry more weight than data from in vitro tests, particularly from non-mammalian systems other than the Ames test, which is a high-weight study. So based on the above, we assigned weights as follows. Negligible weight was attributed to those endpoints not linked to any adverse effect relevant to genetic or carcinogenic hazard or risk. Low weight was attributed to endpoints indicative of primary DNA damage, not unequivocally linked to mechanisms of tumorigenicity, and the test system often has low specificity. And such responses would therefore be evidence of exposure, not necessarily evidence of effect. Moderate weight was attributed to endpoints potentially relevant to tumorigenicity, but may be subject to secondary, threshold-dependent mechanisms, or exhibit a high rate of misleading positives with respect to carcinogen prediction. And the highest weight was given to endpoints that have been demonstrated with a high level of confidence to be linked to the process of tumorigenicity. And this approach to weighting is consistent with, again, the aforementioned recent OECD overview, which states, when evaluating the mutagenic potential of a chemical, more weight should be given to the measurement of permanent DNA changes, i.e. mutations, than to DNA damage events that are reversible. So we set up a grid to give the different studies different weights. Negligible weight was given to an endpoint called cystochromatid exchanges, for which there is in fact no longer any OECD guideline because we do not understand the biology or the relevance of those changes. Low weight mainly to DNA adduct, DNA damage and DNA repair studies in vitro. Moderate weight to those studies in vivo, and also to the more commonly studied endpoints of micronuclei, chromosomal damage, and mutation in mammalian cells. And the highest weight on the right-hand side to in vivo studies for the most common endpoints, so micronuclei, chromosomal damage, gene mutations, and also high weight to the Ames test because it does have a very good correlation with carcinogenic potential. And this rating is consistent with specific guidance published by the European Chemicals Agency in 2015. So, which studies should be included? And this is a key element of the differences of opinion that have been arrived at. The Kaya and Kirkland paper that was mentioned a few moments ago, we reviewed all of the genetic toxicology data that was available, which included a number of studies that had been conducted in various contract laboratories. Not all of them were commissioned by Monsanto. There were a number from other manufacturers. So that review paper contained 90 genetic toxicology studies. 44 of those were on glyphosate alone, and those were not included in the IARC review, but we believe they should have been. In the supplementary tables in that paper, which stretch to about 200 pages, there is a lot of detail. Each study was conducted to GLP. Almost all of the studies complied with relevant OECD guidelines. We detailed the statistical methods that we used, the level of significance that was achieved. And there was a lot of methodological details, so the bacterial strains, the cell types that we used, data on individual replicates, top concentrations and cytotoxic effects so that the robustness of the studies could be evaluated, the number of cells scored, doses and dosing routes for all of the in vivo studies. In fact, far more information than you would ever normally find in a standard published paper in a journal. When we look at the pattern of the positive and negative responses across those studies according to weight, this is what you see for the studies that were reviewed by IARC. So there were 6 high-weight studies that were considered by IARC, 2 of which were positive. And understandably, with a 1/3 positive response, one would be concerned that this may be a reflection of genotoxic potential. But when you include all of the data, the picture is very different. There are still the 2 positive high-weight studies, but now this is out of a total of 39 studies. All of the other high-weight studies are negative. So the picture is very different. Just to summarize very, very quickly, there are no structural alerts for glyphosate for genotoxicity, mutagenicity, carcinogenicity. All of the Ames tests on glyphosate, on formulations, and on the metabolite AMPA are all negative. Glyphosate does not induce gene mutations or chromosomal aberrations in mammalian cells in vitro. There is limited evidence that glyphosate induces micronuclei in vitro, but since we do not see these converted into chromosomal aberrations, they may be due to threshold-mediated effects leading to chromosome loss, or aneuploidy, as it's called. And in vivo, glyphosate does not induce chromosomal aberrations. There is strong evidence that glyphosate does not induce micronuclei in animals, and there's a vast majority of the in vivo micronucleus studies on formulations were also negative. There is evidence that glyphosate and formulations can induce DNA strand breaks, but these might be secondary to toxicity since they're only seen at relatively high and cytotoxic concentrations, and we know that they did not lead to chromosome breaks. And as mentioned earlier, DNA damage is a low-weight category because it may lead to cell death or it may be reversible. Limited evidence of transient DNA breakage for glyphosate and GBFs, but we know that these are not associated with DNA adapts. No evidence of induction of DNA repair, some evidence of induction of sister chromatid exchanges, but as already mentioned, these are now off the table as far as any regulatory testing is concerned because we do not understand the mechanism of induction or the biological relevance. So that's a summary of what we have when we look across the whole range of genotoxicity studies. There are quite a lot of data on non-mammalian studies, non-mammalian other than the Ames test. So studies in fish, amphibians, reptiles, plants. Many of those tests involved exposure by immersion in or surface contact with the test material. It's a non-standard exposure approach, and we really don't know what artifacts might result from that. But in any case, OECD guidelines specifically state that the use of any non-standard test requires justification, along with stringent validation, establishing robust historical negative and positive control databases. For fish, amphibians, reptiles, and plants, there are no internationally accepted guidelines for how to conduct the tests. There are no databases of acceptable negative or positive control responses, so we cannot judge whether we're looking at a good study or a bad study. And there are no results from validation studies indicating concordance with carcinogenicity. So we believe that these studies on fish, amphibians, reptiles, and plants should not have a significant weight in the overall genotoxicity evaluation. There are some human biomonitoring studies. I don't have the time to go into these, but I can come back to them if there are questions from committee members. Overall, the data are very difficult to interpret, and there are no strong indications. In fact, there is little or no reliable evidence from those human biomonitoring studies that would support a conclusion that formulations, and of course human studies will only be dealing with formulations and not with pure glyphosate, would not support a conclusion that formulations at levels experienced across a broad range of end-user exposures pose any human genotoxic hazard or risk. Finally, just to compare the profile of glyphosate with a typical profile for a genotoxic carcinogen. This table was based on the recommendations of Bolt et al. And Petkoff et al. For a known genotoxic carcinogen, you would expect to see positive effects across multiple key endpoints, both in vitro and in vivo. We do not see that with glyphosate. There's an occasional positive result here or there, generally in non-standard, non-mammalian systems. A genotoxic carcinogen would expect to give a structural alert, and we do not get a structural alert from glyphosate. A genotoxic carcinogen or one of its metabolites would be expected to bind to DNA, to have electrophilic properties. There is no evidence that glyphosate can bind to DNA. With a genotoxic carcinogen, test results are usually highly reproducible, both in vitro and in vivo. Where we do see positive results with glyphosate, they are conflicting, non-reproducible, often inconsistent across the same test category. Genotoxic carcinogens generally give clear dose responses across a wide range of concentrations or exposure levels. With glyphosate, we do not see that. Where there are positive responses, there are not clear dose responses, And finally, responses with a genotoxic carcinogen are typically found at non-toxic exposure levels, whereas with glyphosate, we generally only see them at under toxic conditions. So there is virtually no concordance between the characteristics of a typical genotoxic carcinogen and the characteristics of glyphosate. So, in conclusion, substantial evidence, particularly from the Ames tests, that glyphosate and GBFs do not induce mutations. Some evidence that glyphosate can produce unstable chromosomal damage, but the evidence that this indicates a potential to induce stable chromosome mutations is limited, conflicting, and potentially due to secondary mechanisms. The failure of glyphosate and GBFs to induce responses in well-validated systems does not support the conclusion that they are acting via a genotoxic mode of action. So we believe that this critical weight of evidence supports a conclusion that glyphosate does not pose a genotoxic hazard. As mentioned earlier, this panel was convened by Intertek. The report has been published, went through highly extensive review. I've never seen a paper that's had 7 different reviewers. And I can say absolutely and categorically, this paper was not ghost written. We all input our own sections to the paper. There was no input, involvement, or influence of the review by Monsanto. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Now I have 4 speakers.